Okay, welcome, Matthew. Let's get started. So, in Jobs to Be Done, we talk a lot about having this common language, and a lot of that is around seeking alignment and fostering cultures around collaboration and generally accelerating innovation. And so, all of that end result, those outcomes around accelerating innovation efforts, we believe begin with jobs to be done listening. And that's what we're here to talk a little bit about today is how to listen for jobs to be done when you're working with the framework. I am Elaine Mathias, co-founder of the Jobs to Be Done Toolkit, and as you may notice, Jim is not here today. Instead, we have a special guest, Marco. Hi, Matthew. Welcome.
Hello.
Matthew is a mentor of mine, a former boss. I worked on his team when we were in the e-commerce industry, and I have learned an incredible amount from him over the years. So I'm excited to have him here today to help facilitate this micro workshop. Matthew, do you want to say anything about yourself and your background?
Uh, Elaine, thank you so much for having me. Really excited to share some of my experience with you all. As Elaine mentioned, or as you can see from the screen, I am founder of a small experience design and digital strategy consulting firm called Skeptical Digital. And so we focus on kind of pure play user experience, kind of industry agnostic. And so it's a lot of fun to kind of get into a lot of different industries and really focus on experience design that way.
Excellent. Thank you, Matthew. So just checking in with everybody on a couple of things that we have coming up at the Jobs to Be Done Toolkit. Our next mini course is November 10th, 12th, and 14th. This is our really popular mini course that covers the entire core process. I see some folks here today who have taken this course. You will recognize the activity that we're going to do as part of the course. So this is just kind of a little demonstration about sort of to showcase our teaching style and to kind of give you a taste of how we approach learning jobs to be done and, sort of the different elements that you can use in your own toolkit. All right. We also, Jobs to Be Done Untangled is a monthly event. So it happens on the last Tuesday of every month at 12 p.m. Eastern. Our next one is coming up. We have a special guest speaker on November 25th. And so keep an eye out for more information about that. And I'll share links to everything that we talk about today in the follow-up email that you'll receive. So, as I've mentioned, we're going to do a micro workshop today that I'm calling Listening for Job Steps. And this is really just kind of a core activity in the process that Jim and I have developed over the years, where you begin the process of taking the raw data that you're getting from customer interviews. So the things that they're saying when you're having these like in-depth conversations about their behaviors and their activities, and then converting that into more structured data that you can use internally to help understand the entire process and begin to make decisions around where you want to tackle challenges or pain points or understand more information. And so I am going to introduce a little bit behind some of the concepts that we're going to do today. And then Matthew and I will go into a role playing where we'll do some interviewing while the audience listens for job steps. And then we'll do some breakout groups where we'll go into like conversations around what we were listening for and what worked and what didn't work, those sorts of things. So like I said, this is going to be pretty beginner. So for, it's a very distilled version of the entire process. So we're focusing on this one particular step and kind of approaching it from a 101 perspective. So saying that, I am going to talk a little bit more in depth here about what we are going to do today. So here's where I want to get started. So today's Untangled event is a micro workshop, and what we're going to do is show the audience how to listen for job steps in customer interviews. And I've just defined here a couple of terms that we'll use. So I want to just touch base on like kind of what a job step is very basically. In the Jobs to Be Done framework, it's like an action or step that the customer goes through when they're trying to accomplish a specific goal or a job. And generally speaking, it's agnostic of any service or product that you're already offering covering. You want to avoid any references to technology. So there's some rules of formulation here that we're not going to dive into too much in today's workshop, but just know that what you're really listening for is, these actions that the customer is taking when they talk about what they're doing. And so generally speaking, you identify a job step by looking for verbs. So anything that kind of starts with a verb kind of points to this action or step that they might go through that can then be sorted later on. So in the example I'm using, we can talk about this will look very familiar to some people. Attending a conference is a common focus job. And within that focus job, you might hear job steps that look like research options or decide to attend, get approval. So the customer is talking about these activities in the process of kind of accomplishing that focus job for attending a conference when they're deciding what they want to do and making that, kind of what tips them towards one option or another, how they go about getting approval, or if there are any additional steps that they have to take in order to complete the, purchasing a ticket, those sorts of things. And similarly, qualitative interviews, I just want to kind of touch base on this in case people have questions about how that's defined. But a qualitative interview, it's generally a customer interview. So it's just in-depth and open-ended conversation where you have typically an interviewer or a moderator who's asking questions of the subject or the research participant, the interviewee. And what you're trying to understand are like experiences and, what are the different things that are happening around the process that they're trying to complete or the job. Or, it can be other types of qualitative interviews like usability tests where you're, asking them to think through the process as they're clicking through things. There are various types of qualitative interviews, but generally speaking, I'll just speak about them as customer interviews for the sake of today's mini workshop. And then, of course, in the jobs to be done context, this is the sort of the data source, the raw data that you're beginning with. And then what jobs to be done helps you do is sort of going through that raw data, extract it into these buckets of circumstances, steps, desired outcomes. And then those buckets kind of help you structure further steps, in terms of how you want to understand like levels of satisfaction or opportunities for development. But this is sort of that point in the process where you're transitioning from having raw data into something structured. And job steps specifically can be used as like a baseline for other types of mapping. So if you want to dive deeper into like a customer interview or any other type of qualitative research, it can kind of help with that. So as I mentioned, this is kind of like a great place to get started with jobs to be done is understanding the job step and then just identifying them by highlighting verbs. Are there any questions about job steps at this point? Cool. Yes, Matthew.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm super excited about this and to learn a bit more. But I was just wondering, like, one of the things I kind of struggle with jobs to be done is like, how does it differ from ta tasks and goals, like, of the user? Like, is it just semantics when you're talking about job steps and jobs to be done versus like tasks and goals, or like, yeah,
It can be. So in general, I think that with jobs to be done, it's nice to have alignment around the language. And so there's some specificity there when you talk about, these different buckets of information that you're trying to put information in. But generally speaking, like to me, like completing a job is very similar to completing a goal. And there is a lot of overlap with like task analysis, which you might come across in design research, where you're really looking at like how are people using a tool to complete a certain task. A lot of it is sort of scope or project dependent. For instance, like a job versus a task versus a goal versus an outcome. It sort of depends on what you colloquially use within like your organization and what people are commonly referring to. But there's also a level of purism around, when you use when you talk about a focused job, it's very singular. It should, be formatted a certain way, whereas like goals or outcomes could be more like user story driven.
Oh, thank you.
Um, So really quickly, just to touch base on why are we doing this? As I mentioned, these are the job steps are like the starting point, and then just having the opportunity to practice this activity is a great way to learn how to like listen and bucket information quickly. If you're really new to any type of customer research or voice of customer type activities where you're going out there and you're listening in on what people are saying about your product or service, but you're not really sure what to do with the notes you're taking, you know, converting that information into job steps is a really great way to kind of capture and share it with the rest of the team. And then, you know, with the demonstration scenario that Matthew and I are going to do in the role play portion, we can help you practice using jobs to be done in your daily work. So this is just a really common sort of core, anytime you're doing anything that's like customer focused, UX design, design strategy, this activity of listening in on customer interviews, taking notes, and then, you know, learning how to sort of take that information and put it back with the team as structured data is a really great way to just help drive decisions and kind of influence the conversation at a more strategic level, honestly. Matthew, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you summed it up really well.
Great. So lastly, now I'm going to dive into the instructions for the mini workshop a little bit, which is basically how are we doing it? So using the scenario that I'm going to provide on the screen in just a moment, I'm going to ask you to imagine that you're taking notes while listening in on a qualitative research interview. So I'll be interviewing Matthew about the focus job on behalf of a startup that is sort of in this imaginary scenario we've identified. And I'll be asking Matthew some questions using the jobs to be done research interview script that Jim and I typically work with, which just essentially asks questions along the beginning, middle, and end type progression. So I'm, you know, trying to understand how Matthew accomplishes his goal of preparing a meal, or, you know, the outcome of preparing a meal, however we want to refer to it. But in the context of this, it will be the focus job. And the focus job, preparing a meal, is also commonly referred to as the jobs to be done. So sometimes if you see it on any kind of, you know, product requirement documentation, it might say like jobs to be done, prepare a meal. But we refer to it as the focus job at the toolkit. And then I'll be asking you to take notes, listening specifically for the job steps or statements that Matthew mentions that begin with verbs. And you'll put each of your the notes that you take on the job steps on individual colored squares in the workspace that you'll have a few minutes to assign yourself to in a moment. And then afterwards, we'll break out into small groups for discussion. So basically what you'll be doing is on each colored square, every time you hear Matthew mention a job step, you'll notate it, and each job step will go on individual squares. So I'm going to zoom out on the workspace a little bit, and you can see here, I'm going to post a link in the Zoom chat, and so everybody will want to come in and select a workspace, you know, in one of these areas. And then inside of each workspace, you'll have a place to put your name, a note on the focus job, and then in here is where you will take your notes. Okay. And then the scenario that we will be working with today is that you imagine that you're working for a startup called Fun Meals, and you are looking for opportunities to grow your user base. So you're going to listen in on this research interview between your team's researcher and a potential customer about his experiences preparing a meal. And then every time you hear Matthew mention a job step, note it down in a colored square. And then after the job interview and listening exercise, we'll do some breakout discussions, and then we'll wrap up with like a facilitated group discussion where we'll all come back together. So I'm going to take a couple minutes here for everybody to get into the mural. I'm going to post this link in the chat. Let's see where that is. If you aren't able to get into the mural, it's fine. You can also just kind of play along at home and post, you know, you can still participate in the discussion afterwards and share in the group chat if you'd like. All right. So I see people joining. Everybody's able to get in, navigate over to these sections, and assign yourself. Okay, so I am going to go ahead and now get started with the role play interview. It looks like everybody has done a good job of grabbing a workspace. I'm going to zoom in on this scenario. All right, Matthew,
Hello.
thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I really appreciate it.
I
Just
was
to give
happy to
you
be
some
here.
context, I am here researching how people prepare meals so that we can better understand the process that you go through and understand what matters to you when you're going through preparing a meal. There are no right or wrong answers. I'm just interested in hearing about your experience. I'm going to record our conversation and take some notes. There are also a couple of other people listening in as note takers. But we're mostly just focused on listening to what you have to share with us, and everything will be kept confidential. Does that sound okay?
That sounds great.
Great. So again, feel free to share as much detail as you like. The more specific you can be, the better. And if I ask any questions that don't make sense, just let me know. So
Okay.
think about the last time you prepared a meal. Can you tell me a little bit about what happened and walk me through the process from beginning to end?
Sure. So I'll talk about preparing dinner last night. I guess I'll start by saying I cook for two adults and two children. I would consider myself relatively advanced as a home cook and quite improvisational. Um, One of the first things that I started with when I was preparing dinner last night was I started by making rice. One of the first things that I do when I'm cooking for my family is uh, kind of just like pick a direction in terms of what culture are we eating from tonight. And so I was sort of in a mood yesterday to go in kind of a more Asian direction. So I got my rice cooker ready to go, made enough rice for everybody, and just let that start. Um, I'll also say that last night while I was making dinner, my wife was out picking up our children from school and activities. And so, I was doing this at home. And so it'll come up later on that I needed to get some things from the store. But, started by making some rice and then having two young children, they have somewhat limited palates. And so when I'm cooking a meal for my family, it's kind of two tracks that happen. One is I'm making a meal for them, for the kids, that is, sort of within the narrow band of flavors that they will appreciate. And then I'm making something for me and my wife that's a little more complex. And so the two directions, one was it's kind of a pre-made Indian Madras lentils that I made for my children. And then for me and my wife, I made chicken adobo. And so with rice and lentils, lentils is pretty simple. It comes in a pouch. It's pre-made. You crack the pouch open, you throw it in the microwave. It takes about a minute. And then with the chicken, there are a few steps um, I that are sort of involved in making it. Well, I guess first of all, I came to that decision to pick these two dishes because I evaluated what I had in my refrigerator and in my pantry and tried to do something that wouldn't require me to go out shopping for new things. So I had some chicken in my freezer. I defrosted that and marinated and seasoned that. This is a recipe that I know really well, and so it was something where I already knew I had the ingredients on hand. I really didn't have to measure a whole lot. I just went about, preparing kind of by memory. Um, so getting the chicken ready, cutting and smashing cloves of garlic, heating up our wok, and getting kind of the cooking steps for the chicken ready to go. Um, at this point, this is sort of, I'm about an hour out from dinner. I still have some work to do, so I go back and I do some work, sort of multitasking, and then maybe a half hour later, come back to cooking dinner. So at that point, I'm kind of actively at the stove, making the chicken, kind of making sure that kind of getting the first sear on it. So it's a braised chicken dish. So get it into the wok on a high heat. Uh, and then it's sort of actively on the stove for about 10 minutes or so. Um, and then during that 10 minutes, I'm kind of killing time in the kitchen, appreciating that I have a moment of quiet while my family is still out. And then um, what I'll do after that initial part is with braising, it's a cooking method where there's a lot of downtime. And so I'll throw in the rest of the garlic, the seasonings, there's soy sauce, there's vinegar, bay leaves, black pepper. Sorry if I'm making folks hungry right now. But and then put that, turn it up to a boil, cover it, reduce the heat to low, and then it sits until basically the chicken cooks thoroughly, and that takes anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour, and you can let that run for quite a long time, and it just gets better. And so while I was doing that, I started to prepare plates and get the table ready and make sure that we could all sit down and enjoy this meal together once my family returned home. One of the things that we do in my family when we have chicken adobo is we have it with pineapple. And it occurred to me that we did not have pineapple when I was uh, looking through our refrigerator. And so I sent a text message to my wife and asked her while she was out getting the kids if she could make a quick stop at the store just to pick up some cut pineapple for us. And so um, that was sort of a missed ingredient on my part, but it was something that she was able to take care of. Um, as I was setting the table, threw some lentils for the kids in the microwave, and then my family started streaming in. They were hungry. Rice at that point was ready to go. Lentils at that point were cool enough for my kids to eat. Chicken was still on the stove and sort of a few minutes away, but we were all able to kind of eat around the same time. So that was
Awesome.
the last meal.
Thank you for that. That was a really great overview of the entire process of preparing a meal. I have a couple of follow-up questions.
Sure.
First, can we revisit how did you know everything you knew that you had everything you needed? You mentioned kind of taking this assessment at the beginning of the process, but can you tell me a little bit about what you expected to see in the cabinets, what was maybe missing that you couldn't find, how you would make it, substitutions, anything along those lines?
Right. So when I'm shopping for groceries, I know that there are certain things that are sort of in stock all the time, or I try to keep in stock all the time. And so I'll keep a few pieces of chicken, a few, ground meat, sausages, things like that in the freezer at all times, sort of anticipating that I'm going to need to improvise a meal on short notice. When it comes to things like garlic, I know that those keep, and so I'm able to kind of buy those, keep them around for weeks or even months, and they're not going to go bad per se. And then with the other spices and sauces, I was able to sort of check my pantry before I started going uh, to verify that, yeah, I have enough to make this dish today.
Great. And then lastly, just one sort of reflection question. Is this typically how you usually prepare meals, or was it different somehow?
This is pretty normal. It's like I was saying, it's somewhat improvisational in the sense that this was not a meal I set up sort of days in advance. Right, it was something that kind of came together that same afternoon, and I think in terms of the amount of time that I spent kind of actively in the kitchen, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 15-20 minutes. But it can be that little time or up to maybe a couple of hours before that I'm really, sort of thinking about it. But yeah, thinking through some of those steps of what do we have? What are the kids going to eat? What are the grown-ups going to eat? Those are pretty typical.
Great. Matthew, this has been a really helpful conversation. Thank you for sharing all of the details with me today. Is there anything else about preparing a meal that we didn't cover that you think would be useful for me to know?
Um, I think one of the things that comes up in my meal preparation is that when I'm choosing a meal, I'm always, and I'm thinking about my children with this also, is I want to make sure that we're not having the same thing every day. So I think about what we've eaten recently and try to make sure that I am, you know, creating some variety for everybody. So, for instance, if we've had pasta the night before, I'm not going to have pasta or something that's Italian again the next night. Right. And so that was certainly, one of the considerations in terms of making a choice of what to prepare for Monday.
Great. Thank you again. I really appreciate your time today. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to the facilitator, and we appreciate everything that you've done. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, so thanks everyone. I am going to, we have a few minutes. I haven't had a chance to check the chat, but if there are any questions, um, Matthew did mention he's hungry. That's great. Let's go back to the scenario. So we're going to go into breakout groups. And what I want during the breakout groups is just for everyone to have a small group discussion about, have you done this before? How does it compare to other types of interview information that you would extract? Just share a little bit about your experience, what worked, what you found easy about the experience, what was challenging, and then, kind of share a little bit. And then we'll come back in 10 minutes and have one person from each group kind of talk about what the discussion was, and then we can have a larger facilitated conversation with Matthew and I. So I'm going to just take a quick moment and go to launch the breakout room. Wait a second, that was not it. Come back. I just made one giant breakout room. Sorry about that, guys. As soon as it closes, I'll relaunch it.
Or you can't trigger the closing of a breakout room.
I can not, it still does the like 60-second countdown. So
Ah,
we're waiting
okay.
now. And then I believe in about 5 seconds we'll be able to redo it. No.
You only gave us a room, a minute.
Sorry about that.
Okay, I'm confused. Is there a room or am I in your room?
I'm assigning them. I'm sorry. Is it are you getting prompted to go to anyone?
Well, I did, and I thought I clicked to join, but nothing happened.
One
I was in a
second.
room by myself.
Okay, hang tight. Sending everyone to some rooms.
Could you send me to the same room as Brett? Because he was just asking me a question, so it'd be good to
Yeah.
not leave him hanging.
Oops. Matthew. Smart. All right.
So it looks like room 1 and room 5 are active.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
I'll pop into room 1 then.
cool. You said you'll pop into one?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. I thought it would like automatically assign, it just created one big breakout group. Oops.
I know, it's so odd. It doesn't like randomly
Yeah.
assign them, which I'm used to anyway. All right,
Uh,
I'm gonna jump into room 1 and then maybe I'll take a look at room 5 later.
all right,
How
cool.
long is this part again?
10 minutes. Let me put the timer
Okay.
up actually. Where is that thing? Beep, beep. Where's my timer? Let me come over here. Okay, great. I will jump into room 5. Oh, looks like they're getting it. I'm gonna. Welcome back. Welcome. All right. Wow, room one is, they'll wait until the very last minute. Everyone a minute to join. We have about 15 minutes left. And this is also a good time if anybody has, general jobs to be done questions as well. It can be specific to the workshop or,
Yeah.
if anything, burning questions. Feel free also to ask questions in the chat. If we don't get to it here, we can bring it up on LinkedIn and have other ways that we can respond to
So,
any questions as well. Yeah.
so Elaine, I would put it to you this way. The question, based on the remarkable experience I had in your instruction, is the job to be done feed the family, or is the job to be done prepare the meal?
So this is, I think, one of the interesting things about working with jobs to be done is that so in this instance, we very purposefully started with a very functional job. It's very, task driven. But then coming out of the process of extracting these insights and data points, you can then kind of spin it, the job to focus on something that might help people shift their perspective on like
Yeah.
where you're innovating or what kind of impact you want to have. And so you're doing exactly the right thing there by suggesting, okay, now that we've heard from the customers and we see this common thread around nourishment or feeding family, now that gives us a different way to maybe think about the features that we're going to put on the roadmap for the next year, or how we're going to position the marketing and align the marketing with the features that we're developing.
Yeah. Why, again, the milkshake thing, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
it's what do I hire this thing to do, right?
yes.
And and so, I mean, and granted, I may be a bit, pedantic on that point, as far as the jobs to be done piece, but that's the only part that kind of threw me personally over.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're asking a lot of the right questions. And, one of the things that comes up also when you suggest shifting the focus job from preparing a meal to like feed the family or, find nourishment is that you then begin to look at, the functional job is a really great baseline, like prepare a meal, right? It's very tactical. It has a very clear outcome. But then from there, you can start to go up and think about some of those aspirations that we talked about, or you can think about it from relative to related jobs. Like there's a lot of definitions that can emerge when you start to compare things around like a centralized axis, which is why, in the canvas, we place the focus job right at the center. Or you can go down and kind of dive even further into those functional aspects and say, we want to focus and understand the plant ingredients portion of prepare a meal. And so you can then kind of dive deeper and branch out as you go, but you're always kind of doing it in a structured manner along this like centralized functional baseline, which is that sort of tactical universal activity of preparing a meal. And that's the hierarchy. When you hear like Venbridge, they have, sort of in their core approach, as well as Scott Burleson, they all have this hierarchy of, jobs to be done. Yes, a KL. So KL is asking in the chat, can you elaborate on the hierarchy? I can share some more research resources that kind of dive into it, but essentially you're looking at information. Jobs to be done is a really great way of helping teams define information relative to other reference points within the organization. And so that hierarchy is just a really common structure that you see applied where you have, that sort of what versus why axis. So, what are people doing functionally versus why are they doing it? And kind of thinking, as I mentioned, you can go on the y-axis from being very high level aspirational, like, survive, basically, anything that's like very kind of high level, Maslow's hierarchy of needs kind of thinking, all the way down into, the most functional steps in terms of like how they might be using a specific product or tool during the prepare a meal phase. If you think about usability task testing as sort of being this, really like closely framed inquiry into how people are clicking through a tool in the process of preparing a meal. What was he higher? What was So in this instance, we don't really have a solution for things that he's hiring. We're still in the problem framing stage of looking at the information. So the solution, like what you're hiring to get done, is the thing that would be informed by this process. So from here, once you've kind of gone through the process of getting customer interview data, you've structured it according to in this process in our approach to jobs to be done. The next step would be the job map, ordering things chronologically, beginning, middle, and end, and then kind of layering on other elements like aspirations or emotions or contextual elements. And then after that, you would start thinking about, all right, what could our customer hire to get this problem done or this pain point that we're focusing on? Yes, Martin, that's the circumstances. So that's another sort of bucket of information that would come along with, extracting job steps and listening for job steps. The next, another part of this process is also listening for those circumstances or listening for the emotions, listening for the aspirations, and then taking that information and doing exactly what Brett was doing, which was kind of spinning the focus job now according to what you want to focus on, developing new features around, such as nourishment or the family specifically.
Yeah, I think it's important to take into account, like using the hypothetical startup of Fun Meals, what is the current scope of Fun Meals and what are Fun Meals capabilities, right? And so, yeah, it's perfectly logical to zoom out a level and to say, let's change the focus job from preparing a meal to feeding my family, right? But feeding my family can take on a lot of different kinds of focus jobs, right? Like I can order out from a restaurant, I can stock my pantry with snacks, right? Or I can prepare a meal, right? And so, within the context of this hypothetical, Fun Meals is sort of saying, like, let's look at this focus job for now, right? Knowing that, yeah, there can be an adjacent job that's a higher level up, right? And there's even, looking at the chat, there are even jobs within that, right? Of like operating a stove, operating a microwave, looking at what ingredients I have. And each one of those can, be translated into features that are relevant for this user.
Yep. So I'm looking at Brett's comment, and I think, another approach to this, if you didn't want to work with job steps, Brett is suggesting you might ask a question instead of the statement. And in this instance, I might say that the question that you could consider asking is, how might we feed a family on a daily basis, and kind of engage with that particular toolkit activity to sort of inform how you generate responses to that question. But in this instance, we were looking for something fairly universal, and you guys are asking all of the right questions around how to tackle, phrasing the focus job. Martin, also, I think in your comment, the thing to point out is that in this instance, because we've chosen such a universal job, the circumstances, the information about preparing a meal for a family with kids would really fall under the circumstances bucket, which isn't something that we were extracting in this or listening for in this particular exercise. We might also consider, as I mentioned, this is just one interview. In a typical research scenario, you would be doing anywhere from probably 3 to 6 research interviews. And you might also be soliciting from people who live alone, or people who, need to prepare special meals while they're traveling. So there are all kinds of other pieces of information that might surface that would then kind of help you understand that more universal job flow or job map that we're looking at around prepare a meal. And then you can dive into things that might be specific. If you also have demographic data about your user base, and you can see that many of them have children in this age group, then you can start to formulate, combine those two pieces of information to develop features and ideas about how you want to solve problems. Yeah, Martin, it depends. Martin's asking if you cycle through multiple times to extract different layers of information. And, typically it's a lot easier in the beginning to cycle through listening for specific elements. So I'll take the transcript in like Google Drive and just go through and tag pieces of information that kind of fall into the different jobs to be done buckets. So anytime I see a job step, I'll just highlight and tag it in the comments as a job step, and then I'll go through and kind of pull all of that out into colored squares for the team to use during an upcoming workshop. And then we start to get into like affinity mapping, working with the like jobs to be done canvas, developing a job map and other tools that we would then use downstream. Yes. And that would be what, Mark, that would be one of the outcomes of the workshop, is choosing that next level of focus job that you might want to break down. And that's one of the things that's really nice about the jobs to be done canvas, is that you can really fill out all of this information pretty quickly once you have that kind of core data set or the research around different things. So you might have, even within a single transcript, like multiple focus jobs that you could then extract for further analysis. Cool. Elena, you have a question.
I do have a question about the fact that, just referring to my business, that we have different target audience, sort of. My business, we offer enrichment classes to the children, right? And we have people, parents who are coming because the educational value. We have people who are coming because it just sort of doesn't matter where, we are just close by and they just need fill out time, like a sort of like a babysitting. So where, how does jobs to be done come together if you have different types of clients? How do you approach that?
So I would recommend, if you can imagine this, continuing to distill down the common behaviors until you arrive at the job to be done that's common amongst all of your demographics. And then start there with the focus job, and then begin to kind of spin the focus job based on what you're hearing in the interviews, kind of the way that Brett was showing us, where he talks about, shifting the focus job from prepare a meal to find nourishment. So that's a really good way that when you distill the focus job down to the common thing across all your audiences, then you have a good baseline for understanding other contexts or circumstances. And then those sort of align, that's where things start to align with your segment.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll say like one client experience that I have that might be relevant here is I did some work a long time ago with General Motors. And if I look at this framework of jobs to be done and thinking about that time there, the focus job was selling cars. But when we got into this same kind of idea too of what happens when you zoom out a little bit, and it really became a question about mobility. And what does mobility look like? And that can look like things like car shares, taxis. It can even look like e-bikes and segways and things like that. And so, within the scope of that project, the focus job remained, we're trying to sell cars here. And but keeping that idea of mobility in mind, I think changed how we thought about the scope of this a little bit, and it helped us to see opportunities where if we were just really constrained on this narrow idea, we would have missed.
That's a great example. Excellent. I have a few minutes if anybody has any additional questions. Matthew, I don't know if we need to get going. Feel free to hop off.
I can
know
stay
we're
around.
at time. Great. For those that are still on or in the
Hey,
chat room.
Elaine,
Yeah.
Claire Eng had sent a note about how many interviews was optimum. And again, that's a very broad question given there's a whole lot of stuff to that. But in general terms, how many viewpoints do you want to get on a, okay, we'll say prepare a meal, right? So how many of these at that level do you want to get? And then, how many at a different level? Is it different at the broader or less, more, or whatever? What's your experience on that?
So the general rule of thumb for qualitative interviews is a minimum of 3 to 4 interviews.
Okay.
Bare minimum, I would say 3, because what you're looking for from these interviews in any kind of qualitative research situation, you're looking for patterns of behavior. So you're kind of trying to look across like 3 different people that are doing this focus job or whatever it is that you're interviewing for, and then you take that information, all 3 of them, you line it up and you sort of say, okay, this is, these are the patterns that we're seeing in terms of what they're doing. And that's how you develop behavioral patterns. So it sort of depends now after that point of doing the bare minimum number of research interviews. Now you run into things like budget, scope, access to users. There are all kinds of factors at play there that might influence, how much feedback you're getting or how many interviews you're able to conduct. Certainly the biggest one that I've experienced is just access to users. That can be, a bit of a challenge. The other things that you might face is just your ability, the size of the team and their ability to like process the information. There are different ways. Like, so typically what would happen is that you have maybe, let's say if you're doing 8 interviews, you might do them over the course of 10 business days or 2 consecutive weeks. And then what's happening around those interviews? Do you have team get-togethers at the end of the day or after the interview for 15 minutes where you synthesize what everybody was hearing? Or is it just kind of on one person to process a transcript and come back and provide the insights in a wrap-up presentation? So that will also impact things as well, just in terms of, and then additionally, the speed at which you're able to execute on different types of interviews. So let's say you go through a short round of interviews for prepare a meal, and now you want to do another round of 3 to 4 interviews with people who are preparing a meal with a family specifically. And so you might put that into the project plan. Like, we're going to do research around this one thing on week 1. Then we're going to decide, what we want to dive deeper on. So we'll have 1 week to recalibrate on that. And then a 3rd week where you'll actually go back in and whatever that deep dive thing that you learned from the first round of interviews. So there's cycles there that you
Sure.
can get into as well.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that to answer Claire's question, right? Like the sweet spot depends on how narrowly you've scoped and how quickly patterns are going to emerge, right? And so if, like, let's take the preparing a meal example. If you screen the customers that you're interviewing to be a very narrow scope, like let's say you screen for income level, you screen for demographics, you screen for cultural background, you screen for, experience level, any other factors, right? You narrow your interview set, you're more likely with a narrower customer set to have patterns emerge more quickly. If you don't do that screening, right, and you say we want to just, have fun meals, serve anybody who ever eats anything, patterns are going to take a long time to emerge if you haven't kind of done that screening, right?
Sure.
Or you might end up without kind of qualifying the interview findings that you're receiving. Of, if you haven't kind of done that step beforehand to say, like, where am I looking for patterns to emerge from?
Right. So let me ask you a question, Marco. In your scenario, the way
Yeah.
you were playing it, were you playing it as a typical? Well, I'm not typical. Were you playing your role as a guy who, or as a customer, or as a, whatever, um, that in other words, the demographic was families who generally cook their own meals, or were you trying to basically be an outlier on purpose, as most families don't, for whatever reason, aren't inclined to make, exotic meals,
Sure.
2 layers of exotic meals, I mean, I don't know about you, man. I grew up, it's like you have two choices, dinner or not dinner. So
Yeah. I
And-
mean, I literally described what I got last night. That was how I played it.
yeah.
But that's part of why I did like that thing of saying up front, this is the experience level that I'm at, right? This is the demographics, this is the family circumstance that I'm in, and this is part of that ritual that I have, right? Because I know that if I know that this is a role-playing exercise, but if I hadn't said that information, right, like that's not necessarily sort of innate to the answers.
Uh,
yeah, go ahead.
I have a quick response. So first of all, you're smart to pick up on this, and that is acknowledging that this is a curated scenario, right? Like I went into this, I know Matthew, I know that he loves preparing food for his family, but he is intended within the context of the scenario to sort of function as an everyman, right? And you point out a really important element of, I think, just knowledge management in general, and that is that like definitions happen through comparison. So when we're talking about building those behavioral patterns, we gain insights by being able to look at like Matthew's experiences of preparing a meal versus yours, which is where you kind of get what you get, or you have to stay at the whatever it is. There's information in that process of comparison that tell us like point towards pain points or opportunities down the road.
I think also it's very easy to get drawn into the specifics of, a particular meal. You're almost there with Matthew as he was preparing it. And there's a sort of stage, I think, where you have to sort of hover up a little bit and sort of think, okay, so there's a sort of stage, even though he talks about it, 3/4 of the way through the interview. Oh yeah, but I've also got to think about the shopping and and I've got the storing of it, and we've actually got other things going on that mean that I'm usually got the stuff around, but sometimes I don't. So, but these are kinds of, as you say, pain points, but they're sort of, there's a structure there that you could then say, well, look, there's a structure there that is generic enough to be able to be tested in the next interview. So it's not just about the fact he was doing a Chinese or whatever it was inspired meal. That's not the point at this stage. It might be later. It might be to do with variety, and some people say are looking for variety, and that's driving some of their behaviors. And what they're trying to get out of it. I want to show that I'm a loving father, kind of thing. I know that that's a slightly different job, but I think there is levels anyway. So I'm saying.
Yeah, no, you bring up a really good point, which is that kind of having that baseline, or setting up that structure is it's a great place to start.
Well, that's the hard part. That's what makes this difficult. It's
yeah.
When I use the methodology in conversation, when you say something, what do you hire this meeting to do? I do algorithm analysis for organizations, right? So what do you hire this meeting to do? People don't think of meetings as something you hire, right? And so again, you get back to what's the problem or what's the outcome you're trying to achieve, right? I go to Home Depot not to drill a 1/4 inch hole. It's because not to buy a drill, because I want to drill a 1/4 inch hole. And really, what it is I want to hang a picture in my house, right? So what is it that, in this case, Matthew is trying to accomplish? Matthew is trying to accomplish is trying to complete the family's day, take care of his family at the end of their day. And the subset of that is I want to feed my family. Cool, right? And then I also, the other job that's in here that's not been spoken about is Matthew's desire to cook as an activity that he himself likes. The other Matthew says, I want to impress my wife, which is also an important thing. But so it's really, we got to think about these things in much broader terms. And the this methodology causes you to have to expand your thinking in a way that most times don't happen over.
Yeah, that's what we like about it. It's that perspective shift.
No, it's definitely an eye-opening perspective shift. I think, when I was in the breakout room that I was in, I was hearing a lot of people describe certain kinds of follow-up questions that they would have wanted to have. Right. And I think that that's kind of that's a natural outcome of something like this, especially when you're dealing with kind of a broad subject like preparing a meal. And I think one of the things that kind of reiterate the General Motors experience that I had was, kind of screening counts for a lot here, right? Like knowing different people's levels and what they're bringing to it in advance, so that the patterns that are emerging are going to be kind of, relevant within a group, right? Like people who are, purchasing for themselves, for purchasing an automobile for personal use are different than people who are purchasing an automobile for commercial use, right? Or people who are leasing or people who are buying, people who have done it before, people who have not done it before, right? You're going to see patterns that emerge across all of those different demographics, but doing some of that screening ahead of time, right? And will help you to kind of narrow down like what are the jobs that are specific to some of these groups, right? I think the people we're finding from my kind of description of how I cooked a meal, there are, people were latching on to things like the fact that I'm, feeding my family, right? Or that, I'm thinking about ingredients. But there are other people who you might be interviewing in the context of fun meals who don't have those, right? Who are cooking for themselves or are not experienced, or, they're ordering out most of it.
I also, on that point that Matthew mentioned, his group had some follow-up. So typically we did this in 10 minutes. But when I typically moderate a jobs to be done interview, there is a fairly long section up front where the person is going through the process. I often find I don't have to ask questions like, what did you do next? What did you do next? Because they understand from the introduction what I'm looking for. But that last 30 minutes, I'm really going back through my notes and saying, okay, dive deeper into, like you said, impressing the wife or other things that I heard during that first longer session that I want. And that's why it's helpful. I'll share out a link to our interview script that we use, but it can be helpful to have something like that in front of you. So you have, as part of your moderator's guide, like preset questions that help you get to some of that structure as well.
I just asked a question in the chat, so I might as well say it out loud. But do you generally ask about the job, sort of in general, or say from the last time that they did it, which is kind of like what we do with Matthew, or both?
I go both ways. So if I'm asking about the job more generally, I might say something like we're interviewing people about their experience preparing a meal. And I'm going to ask you to think about the last time you prepared a meal, or,
Okay.
think about, or you could just say, think about how you begin the process of preparing a meal and kind of see how they take it. If you're asking, the most common way to do it is to ask them to think about the last time they prepared a meal. That comes from Bob Modesta's methodology quite a bit, and it's a fairly common practice in qualitative interviews because the assumption there, this is sort of a psychological best practice, is that people are going to have the most accurate memory around their most recent experience. You'll get the most detail out of it if you ask it that way.
Do you find anything? Sorry, you go, Brett. No, you go.
No, I was going back to the milkshake analogy from Clayton Christensen. They didn't they the whole takeaway on that is that people generally were doing this as a repeated behavior. That was the big takeaway on the milkshakes, right? It wasn't like it was a one-time thing. Tell me what you did the last time. So, I'm thinking in this scenario is a great example of that is meal preparation in general terms, not the one experience, but is it okay? You have kids that are regularly involved in soccer or activities or whatever. So, one parent is out with the kids doing this, so the other parent is prepping the house so that when the kids get back, they have some kind of a routine. They come in, they eat their meal, then they go to take a bath, and then they go home, right? Go to bed. As opposed to the enjoyment of cooking, as an activity, which is a different approach, different thing. It's a different job essentially to be done because now, what you're trying to the 1/4 inch hole you're trying to drill is it's a different 1/4 inch hole than if you're trying to sit there and, you know, feed a family of four that's very busy, that has a very, uh, busy schedules.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, I mean, I mean, we're definitely overthinking this, and I appreciate that because that's the kind of thing I do for a living. But
I'd like to add some color to Elaine's response also, and to answer Martin's question. There's
sure,
another wrinkle here, which is what is the job and how often does a person do it? Right. I
yeah,
think preparing a meal is a daily thing, but if your focus job was buying a home, right, that's something that people do somewhat rarely
right.
in their life. Right. And so the ideas of how often you've done this and kind of describe the general process of buying a home is not going
Good
to be
point.
as relevant. Right. And so if you have to have some self-awareness of what kind of a task, or what kind of a job you're asking about. And then the other thing that I'll say is that when you phrase it as tell me about the last time, you put the interviewee in a mode of telling a story. And what follows then is something where they're drawing from memories, they're drawing from details that are specific to one kind of event, or to, one, moment in time, right? They're not thinking in terms of generalities. And I would say that my experience is that the details provide a richness, and more patterns tend to emerge from those than the generalities that come from tell me about meal preparation in general.
Go ahead, Martin.
I was wondering, the experience of doing this. Obviously, as you're saying, this is for an evening meal. Does it's the context we all know, but how do you find doing it with things like B2B, business to business type situations where you're trying to work out how business decision makers sort of approach things? Are there any watch outs or things to take into consideration in that context?
From a B2B perspective, I think one of the things I think about is what is the job that we're asking about, and how frequently does somebody engage with something
Okay.
like this.
Yeah.
Another thing that I think about is, are we asking, like, what is our context, right? Like, for instance, if fun meals is something that is uh, more akin to other kinds of food delivery startups or grocery stores that customers are familiar with, right? Then, we may not have to kind of do as much qualification. But if we're trying to introduce a very innovative idea, right, into the world, and we're trying to learn from a user or a customer, what is how do you go about doing this job now? Then yeah, you're going to need to ask, some kind of different questions to tease out the detail to kind of bridge that gap. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing I was, kind of getting at with you earlier, Matthew, is your experience. Are you representing the typical experience, or are you representing the anomalous experience? Um, and I mean, I asked that in the context of the interview. In other words, I mean, to Claire's point, you're going to interview 4, 5, 10 people, whatever, and you're going to
Yeah.
have a range. I'm just saying, is of the 4 or 5 people that she's already interviewed, which one are you? Are you representing? And that was what I was going at, because I mean, you're giving a pretty exotic experience there. You know what I mean? I'm going to do this kind of thing with this kind of spices over here. Meanwhile, I'm just cooking here. We're going to braise this. I mean, most people are not doing this on a typical basis, even if they have the time, just because it's not the thing.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Martin.
Though, won't there, Brett? There will be a group. This is, I think, the other thing is, it comes back down to how it's almost overlapping into things like, segmentation, different types of groups of customers, which is why I think, going back to Matthew's point about, it's really important about the screening aspect, how you've set up the actual selection of the people to come into it, because otherwise you've got no context. In a way, I think that's what I was trying to work out what the context was for the thing. So I think it's about that really screening it, and it can be, I do this, I do that, I do that. So claimed behaviors. So you're going in saying, well, this person has self-rated themselves as an inspirational cook, and that they're at that end of some kind of continuum. So I think there's a bit of pre-setting up that helps. and in B2B as well, probably as well.
In B2B, certainly.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that I think about when Elaine and I were, kind of working in the e-commerce space was there's a certain kind of e-commerce, which is you put a quote unquote normal size thing in a box, and that box, arrives at your doorstep. And that's one kind of path of e-commerce that I think a lot of people are familiar with. And then there are other kinds of transactional interactions that do not conform to that pattern, right? And so when you're dealing with that space, and I think this happens a lot more in B2B, you you have to kind of be open to a lot of anomalies in a sense, and think about the idea that there are not really well-defined patterns in some places, depending on how niche your kind of business is, right? And so, in the sense of, does this person come to you representing a typical kind of customer, or do they represent an anomaly? Depending on the line of work that you're in, you might find they're all anomalies, but but they're even within those, there are patterns.
I am going to wrap things up now because I think this conversation could go on for a very long
Could go
time.
on forever.
Very
Yeah.
much enjoying it. Yes, please give us some feedback. Keep an eye out for the resources that we'll send. Matthew, thank you so much for helping facilitate
Yeah.
this
Good.
today.